I remember the way my sister laughed that morning, soft, certain, like she'd already won. It wasn't the first time Elise made me feel small. She'd been doing it for years, turning silence into proof that I didn't belong, rewriting every kindness I ever gave her into weakness. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that family was worth swallowing pride for. But standing there beside our father's casket, hearing her whisper that even he had been disappointed in me, something broke in a place I didn't know could still crack. I didn't cry. I didn't defend myself. I just realized, in a kind of quiet that felt like truth, that I'd spent my whole life apologizing for being the one who stayed honest while everyone else learned how to lie. That was the moment I stopped waiting for fairness. And though she didn't see it yet, the world she built on my silence was already beginning to fall apart. Rain in Texas doesn't fall softly. It carries weight, thick, heavy, the kind that seeps through uniforms and skin alike. The chapel lights flickered against the wet glass, pale and exhausted, the same way everyone in that room looked at me. I stood where they told me to stand, shoulders squared, spine locked, the hem of my dress blues brushing the edge of the pew, the smell of polished wood mixed with wilted lilies and damp air. In front of me, beneath the folded flag, lay the man who'd taught me how to walk through storms without bending, the same man who had once said that honor was the only thing a person could truly own. And now, even that seemed to have been taken from me. From the first row, Elise turned slightly, her perfume cutting through the stale air. Black silk clung to her shoulders like armor. Every move she made was a performance, her chin tilted, smile faint and practiced. I'd known that smile all my life. It always came before something cruel. Beside her sat Brandon, hand resting on her knee, as if to remind me that everything I'd once believed safe now belonged to someone else. She leaned back just enough for her whisper to reach me. "You could at least pretend to feel something," she murmured, voice dipped in sugar and venom. "Dad wouldn't want you standing there like a statue." I didn't answer. I'd spent too many years learning how to silence the things that wanted to claw their way out of me. The air buzzed with whispers, camera shutters, and the self-satisfied hum of distant relatives who adored a well-dressed tragedy. To them, Elise was the grieving daughter. I was the odd one, the rigid, unreadable sister in uniform who didn't know how to cry. Brandon's voice slipped through the noise, smooth and practiced, the same tone he used when he'd once promised me forever. "Still watching the world like you're waiting to correct it," he said quietly, not looking at me. "Maybe that's why no one ever stays." My fingers brushed against the crease of my trousers. It took everything in me not to move, not to let them see how easily words could still bruise, even after all these years. Someone behind us coughed. Someone else whispered that Elise looked radiant, for a woman in mourning. Another relative nodded toward me and muttered something about how I'd always been too stiff. They said it like I wasn't 10 feet away, like grief made me deaf. I lifted my eyes to the casket again. For a second, it felt like my father could hear the noise, and I hated that the last thing surrounding him was pettiness dressed as sympathy. Then, through the window's blur of rain, I saw movement outside, headlights, steady and unmoving, cutting through the gray. A black SUV idled near the gate, engine quiet, wipers swiping in perfect rhythm. The man in the driver's seat was barely visible, but I recognized the stillness in the way he watched. He gave a small nod, subtle enough that only I would notice. My pulse steadied. The weight in my chest shifted, not lighter, not yet, but different. That single gesture meant something was already in motion. I turned back to the front, feeling the stare of my sister on the back of my neck, the judgment of every person in that room. Let them think what they wanted. Let them whisper. I had learned long ago that silence, when used right, could be the sharpest weapon of all. The rain picked up again, hammering against the chapel roof like a clock counting down. Elise adjusted her veil and dabbed at dry eyes. Brandon smiled at a colleague across the aisle, all charm and confidence. Neither of them knew the man outside wasn't there to pay respects. He wasn't there to mourn. He was there to end a lie that had survived far too long. 4 years earlier, Texas felt like it was burning. The air shimmered above the asphalt, the heat heavy enough to make every breath taste like dust and gasoline. I'd been stationed at Lackland Air Force Base for almost 5 years then, working in the Signal Analysis Division. It was the kind of job that demanded precision, quiet judgment, and trust, qualities I'd once believed defined me. At that time, Brandon and I had been engaged for 6 months. He was a civilian aerospace engineer who liked to say he admired my discipline. He claimed he loved how I saw the world in order, not chaos. I wanted to believe him. Maybe I needed to. Because loving someone who respected boundaries made me think my sacrifices meant something. That August night, the heat never let up, not even after sunset. I left the base early, for once, hoping to surprise him with takeout and a half bottle of wine we'd been saving. On the drive over, I called him. The video feed flickered, and when it cleared, it wasn't Brandon who answered. It was Elise. She was wearing a pale blue Air Force shirt, the kind issued to base personnel, complete with a name patch that read Reynolds. Behind her, Brandon sat at his desk, the glow of a computer screen washing his face white. On the monitor, I caught the tail end of a download bar. Secure transmission database, 87%. For a second, I thought it had to be some kind of misunderstanding. I said his name. The image froze. The call dropped. I drove faster. By the time I reached his office, the air inside was stale and cold from the overworked air conditioner. Brandon jumped when I opened the door. Elise didn't flinch. She just turned, hair perfectly arranged. That same smug calm she'd worn since we were kids. He spoke first. Voice caught somewhere between panic and annoyance. "You're early. I was just showing Elise the system. She's helping with something." My eyes went straight to the flash drive plugged into his terminal. The download was complete. Lines of encrypted code filled the screen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I'd been trained to spot patterns, and betrayal has its own unmistakable rhythm. I asked Elise what she was doing there. She smiled, almost tenderly. "He loves me, Tabitha, and he needs this data. You can file a report if you want, but no one's going to believe you. You've built your whole life around following orders. You wouldn't know what to do without them." Her words landed like a knife that had been waiting years to find its mark. I turned to Brandon. He couldn't even meet my eyes. That night, I did what I'd sworn to do in every crisis. I reported the violation. I filed it by the book, including the date, time, access log, and chain of custody. The next morning, the file was gone from the system, every trace of it. 3 days later, I was called into the commanding officer's office. They said there had been concerns about my behavior, that my personal situation might be affecting my judgment. Brandon had told them I was struggling emotionally after the engagement ended. Elise had supported his version, saying she was worried about my mental stability. The suspension letter was clinical, almost gentle in tone. 6 months, mandatory leave. Reason: psychological fatigue following a failed personal relationship. That phrase haunted me. I remember sitting in my car in the base parking lot, uniform jacket folded on my lap, wondering how people could destroy someone so quietly and make it look like help. The next morning, I packed everything I owned into 2 duffel bags. Before driving off, I walked out to the flight line. The jets gleamed under the sunrise, engines silent, wings outstretched like they were waiting for orders that would never come. I used to think the Air Force was the safest place in the world for someone like me, where effort and integrity meant something. But standing there, I finally understood what my father had tried to tell me years ago. Honor is the easiest thing to lose, and the hardest thing to win back. When I drove away from the base, the horizon shimmered red, the color of warning lights and humiliation. Somewhere behind me, Brandon and Elise would go on smiling, convincing everyone that I'd simply burned out. But as I passed the city limits and the desert opened ahead, I made myself a promise. Quiet, absolute, carved into the silence between my breaths. If they had stolen my reputation, I would build something they could never touch again. Not revenge, not power, something rarer, something real. And someday, when they least expected it, the truth they buried would surface, bright, blinding, and impossible to outrun. I left Texas before dawn, when the sky still looked bruised and unfinished. The highway stretched ahead like a strip of steel under a dull moon, and the radio crackled between static and country songs that didn't fit my mood. I drove until the air turned cold enough to bite, until the red clay and mesquite gave way to pale grass and dry wind. Somewhere near Amarillo, my phone rang. It was my father. I let it ring. I couldn't bear to hear the disappointment I imagined in his voice. The quiet question of how his daughter, the one who never broke a rule, had managed to lose everything. The call went to voicemail. A few minutes later, a message arrived. Just one sentence. Don't let them take your honor again. I saved it, but never listened to it out loud. 3 months later, he was gone. A stroke, sudden and silent. I wasn't there. Elise was. She made sure to remind everyone of that detail. By the time I reached Colorado Springs, snow had begun to fall. Thin, windblown. Not quite enough to cover the ground, but enough to change the air. I rented a small apartment near the edge of town. A one-bedroom walk-up with gray walls and warped wooden floors that creaked under every step. It was the kind of place that made silence sound heavier. The first few nights, I barely slept. I unpacked what was left of my life into neat rows, uniforms pressed flat, files locked in drawers, photographs face down in a box. Outside my window, the Rocky Mountains loomed like a warning. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd rebuild piece by piece, but rebuilding requires faith, and faith was something I'd buried back in Texas. Every evening, I ran. The cold bit at my lungs, the snow stung my face, but it was the only time I felt close to control again. I ran until my mind went quiet, until the only thing I could hear was the steady rhythm of my boots against the frozen pavement. I will not break. I repeated to the rhythm, not this time. Mornings were ritual, black coffee, no sugar. The bitter taste reminded me I was still here. On the counter, my father's old pilot watch sat like a relic. The glass was scratched. The second hand frozen between two marks, as if even time had decided to stop. I couldn't bring myself to fix it. Some part of me needed something else to be as still as I felt. Weeks bled together. I spoke to no one outside of work. My reputation followed me even here, whispers that I was volatile, overly rigid, the kind of officer who took things too personally. I learned to stay invisible, to let my work speak where my voice no longer could. Then came the morning everything changed. It started like any other day, gray light filtering through thin curtains, the faint hum of base generators in the distance. I was reviewing a set of encrypted transmissions when an alert flashed across my screen. Unauthorized access attempt, then another. Someone was trying to breach our satellite relay. Instinct took over. I locked the ports, rerouted the signal, and initiated a security loop. The process lasted less than a minute, but in those 60 seconds, I felt alive for the first time in months. When the system stabilized, I sent the report through the proper channels and went back to my coffee as if nothing had happened. 2 hours later, I was summoned to the briefing room. The air inside was sharp with the smell of electronics and old carpet. A few officers sat around the table, their eyes unreadable. I expected a reprimand, some accusation that I'd caused the alert myself. Instead, the door opened, and a man I didn't recognize walked in. He was tall, calm, the kind of calm that came from command, not arrogance. His uniform carried the subtle weight of authority, the silver eagle pins catching the fluorescent light. He looked directly at me, not through me, which was already more respect than I'd had in years. "Good work on the firewall interception, Captain Reynolds," he said. Voice even. "You prevented a full data compromise." I waited for the but. There wasn't one. He studied me for a moment, then added, "I'm not interested in rumors. I care about results. I need someone like you for a new task force. Classified, limited clearance. Think about it." When he turned to leave, I noticed the nameplate above his pocket. Cole, Adam Hale. For the first time since Texas, someone had spoken to me without pity. I didn't realize until later how much that moment would matter. After the meeting, as I gathered my notes, a folder appeared on my desk. Standard issue, black. Unmarked, except for a red tab. I hesitated before opening it. Inside were pages of contract data, procurement codes, audit trails. The final sheet bore a signature line. Lead investigator, federal contract compliance. Below it, the printed name hit me like a blow. Brandon Mitchell. The room went still around me. I read it twice, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less impossible. But they didn't. My ex-fiancé's company, the same one at the center of my downfall, was under federal investigation, and the officer leading that investigation had just asked me to join his team. Outside, snow was still falling, quiet and endless, the kind that erases footprints before you can turn around to look. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running away from Texas. I felt like I was heading straight back toward it. Only this time, I wasn't coming empty-handed. February in Colorado had a way of making even silence feel sharp. The air outside the base cut through fabric, skin, and thought alike. Snow glazed the roads, dull light from the training grounds bouncing faintly off the ice. Inside the command center, the hum of machines was the only warmth we had. I'd been working under Colonel Adam Hale for nearly 3 months. He spoke little, but when he did, people listened. His orders were clipped, deliberate, and always made sense. No wasted words, no needless praise. He never asked about my past, not once. And because of that, I trusted him more than I'd trusted anyone in years. That night, the task force was finishing a quarterly report for Washington. The room was dim, only the glow of screens reflecting against tired faces. I was monitoring outgoing transmissions when something strange flashed across the feed, an irregular packet moving through a restricted channel. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Then I saw the header, Mitchell Systems, Inc. My breath caught. I leaned closer, scrolling through the data. Contract identifiers, shipment logs, security encryption, too clean, too deliberate. Someone was trying to pass classified information through a civilian subcontractor. Adam stepped behind me, quiet as a shadow. His eyes flicked over the screen, then to my face. His voice was low. "You recognize the name, don't you?" I nodded. He studied me a moment longer, measuring something he didn't say out loud. Then, quietly, "I need someone who's dealt with him before. Someone who knows how he operates, but only if you're ready." I understood exactly what he was asking. To take this assignment meant stepping back into the wreckage I'd spent years escaping, to face the man who'd cost me everything. But it also meant the one thing I'd never been given, a chance to clear my name. I nodded again, slow and certain. He handed me a slim file. The top page showed a photograph. Brandon and Elise, arm in arm at a military charity gala in D.C., both smiling under a banner that read, "Proud supporters of the U.S. Air Force." Her diamond bracelet caught the flash of the camera. His hand rested casually on her waist. The sight of it tightened something in my chest, but not because of jealousy. It was recognition, the realization that the same faces that had destroyed me were now profiting from the world that once trusted me. That night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window and opened my father's old watch. The second hand hadn't moved in years. I set it down on the sill, where the reflection of falling snow made it look alive again. For the first time since Texas, I spoke aloud, almost to the quiet itself. "I won't run anymore." 2 weeks later, we flew to Washington. The air there was heavy with exhaust and politics, so different from the clean cold of Colorado. I wore the same measured calm I'd practiced for years. Adam briefed me only once on the plane. I would attend the defense budget session as part of the analysis team. My role was simple: observe, verify, and confirm the inconsistencies tied to Mitchell Systems contracts. The meeting room was carved out of glass and chrome, high above the city. Men in suits and uniforms shuffled papers, exchanged rehearsed smiles, spoke the language of funding and power. And then I saw him. Brandon. He was sitting at the far end of the table. Tailored gray suit, hair slicked back the same way it had been when he'd said he loved me. The company pin gleamed on his lapel, the practiced charm already in motion. For a moment, time folded in on itself. The night I'd caught him with Elise, the way he'd looked at me when he lied. I froze where I stood. Then his eyes lifted and found mine. Shock flickered across his face, so brief it could have been missed by anyone else. But not me. I knew every shift of expression he had ever used to mask guilt. He blinked, smiled politely, as if trying to place me. He couldn't. To him, I was out of context, gone too long, and that suited me perfectly. What he also didn't know was that the man seated at the head of the table, the one he was so eager to impress, was my husband. Adam kept his voice even throughout the meeting, dissecting budgets, timelines, and compliance numbers with clinical precision. If Brandon noticed the undercurrent, he hid it well. But every time Adam addressed the board, his gaze swept briefly past me, a silent reassurance. Stay calm, stay steady, stay invisible. By the time the session ended, my hands had stopped shaking. Brandon approached Adam with the easy confidence of a salesman who thought he'd already won. He started talking about mutual benefit and streamlining communication with federal partners. The same words he'd once used on me, only polished for a bigger stage. Adam listened, expression unreadable, pen tapping softly against his notes. When Brandon finally stepped back, Adam stood, shook his hand once, and said evenly, "We'll review the files. Expect an update soon." The tone was polite, almost casual, but I'd been around him long enough to hear what others couldn't. It wasn't a promise. It was a warning. When the doors closed behind us, I exhaled for the first time in hours. My pulse was still uneven, my palms damp inside the thin gloves. Adam walked beside me through the corridor, saying nothing until we reached the elevator. Then, in a voice low enough for only me to hear, "The game just started. Captain Reynolds." The elevator doors slid shut, reflecting the faintest curve of a smile on his face. I didn't smile back. Not yet. But I knew what he meant. For years, I'd carried the shame of being the woman no one believed, the one who lost everything for telling the truth. Now, the same truth was walking back into the room with a federal badge behind it. And this time, I wasn't the one under investigation. Saturday morning came with the gray light of a storm that never quite arrived. I was halfway through drafting a security report when the knock came. 3 short taps. Polite but firm. On the welcome mat lay a thin envelope stamped from Texas. No return address, just my name written in a hand I hadn't seen since before the funeral. I stood there for a moment, the paper already damp from the cold air drifting through the open door. When I tore it open, a folded document slid out, a photocopy of my father's will. My eyes caught on the first line that mattered. Beneficiary, Elise Reynolds. Every asset, every property, everything he'd built over a lifetime of service was listed under her name. At the bottom of the page, there was a handwritten note. The ink had bled slightly, as if it had been written in a rush. "One day, you'll understand why I left everything to your sister." I read that sentence again and again until the words blurred. Understand what? That he trusted her more than me? That after all the years of his lectures on integrity, he'd chosen the one person who had none? Anger came first, sharp, bright, familiar. Then confusion followed, slower and heavier. Something about the will felt off. My father's signature had always been crisp, with a looped R that leaned slightly left. This one slanted the other way, too smooth, too neat. It wasn't his hand. I knew it the way a daughter knows the sound of her father's voice in a crowd. I didn't trust my instincts anymore, but I trusted facts, so I reached out to an old friend from the forensic lab. A quiet favor, nothing official. I sent her the scanned signature with no explanation. 2 days later, a secure message appeared in my inbox. The comparison was clear. The signature on the hospital transfer order didn't match my father's. It matched Brandon's. I sat back, staring at the screen, the hum of the apartment filling the silence. Brandon! Of course! Elise had always needed someone to do the dirty work, and he'd always been eager to please. Together, they'd signed away my father's life and turned his estate into their next trophy. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was fraud. It was a federal crime. I forwarded the evidence to Adam through the encrypted line we used for internal briefings. For a long time, there was nothing, no reply, no acknowledgement. Then my phone buzzed with a single message from him. On my way. When he arrived, he didn't waste words. He read through the file once, his jaw tightening slightly as he reached the end. He closed it, looked at me, and said in that calm, deliberate tone that could make chaos sound like procedure, "This isn't a financial discrepancy anymore. It's forgery, a federal offense. Elise just crossed a line she can't come back from." I felt something uncoil inside me, not relief, not yet, but the faint shift of gravity when justice starts to tilt back in your direction. Adam's expression softened. "We're going back to Texas," he said quietly. "But this time, you're not going alone." Outside, snow had begun to fall again, lazy flakes drifting past the window. The first time I'd left Texas, I'd driven through darkness and fear, carrying shame that wasn't mine. This time, I would return with the truth in hand, and someone beside me who believed it. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of going home. I was afraid of what they'd see when I did. The flight into Austin felt heavier than any deployment I'd ever taken. The air outside the cabin was thick with humidity, pressing down like a memory I hadn't asked to relive. As the plane descended, I caught sight of the city lights glimmering through the rain. Familiar, distant, and unforgiving. 4 years? That's how long it had been since I'd last set foot in my father's house. Back then, it smelled like leather, aviation oil, and fresh coffee, the scent of discipline and quiet pride. Now, when the front door opened, it reeked of expensive perfume and cheap victory, Elise's perfume. Her voice carried from the living room before I even reached it, sweet and theatrical, the kind of tone people use when they know they're being watched. She glided toward me in a black dress that was more cocktail than morning, all pearls and poise, her arm already outstretched. "Tabitha," she sang out, wrapping me in an embrace that smelled like Chanel and deceit. "You still like playing the hero, don't you? Everyone, meet my sister, the Air Force officer who's so dedicated she forgot how to live." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The sound hit like glass breaking. Brandon stood nearby, a crystal glass in hand, smiling that polished smile he'd used to sell lies and contracts alike. "She's proof that not everyone in uniform makes it to the top," he said smoothly. "Maybe you should come work for me." "Tabitha, we could use someone meticulous. Assistant, perhaps." My lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. I looked at him, measured my words carefully. "If I ever left the service," I said evenly, "no one in this house would have a home left to come back to." The laughter died instantly. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Elise's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, before she recovered with a scoff. "Oh, is that a threat now?" I didn't answer. I simply set my glass down, took out my phone, and typed 6 words. "Eagle cleared. Time on target, 1900. Then, I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Outside, the rain thickened, hammering the roof with steady rhythm. Somewhere in the corner, the old clock my father had loved began to chime, deep and deliberate. Each strike echoed like a countdown. I kept my face calm, but every sense was alert, every whisper, every glance. Elise was entertaining a handful of guests from my father's business circles, people who'd once shaken his hand with respect, now nodding along to her revision of history. The house had become a theater, and she was center stage, rewriting the past with every glass of wine poured. I slipped out to the hallway for air. That's when I heard them. Their voices came from the side corridor, half muffled by the rain. Elise's tone was sharper now, stripped of sweetness. "He should have given it all to me from the start," she hissed. "If that old lawyer doesn't bring back the original, everything stays mine." Brandon's reply was quick, confident. "Relax." I deleted the original file. "The only copy left is the one you control." My pulse stilled. The original will. It still existed once, and if they were afraid of it, someone else must have kept it safe. The lawyer? I stayed silent in the shadows, barely breathing, when their footsteps faded. I pulled out my phone again and opened the secure line. Adam's voice crackled through the static, low and steady. "The original exists," I said softly. "They think it's gone. Start phase 2. His reply came after a pause. "Copy that. Hold position." I hung up and returned to the living room. Elise was laughing again, head tilted back as if the world had forgiven her. She didn't notice the way my gaze lingered on the clock, or the storm building outside the window. By 7, the rain had turned violent, slanting sideways across the glass. The lights flickered once. Guests began gathering coats, sensing the night was over. Elise insisted everyone stay for one more toast. Brandon poured himself another drink, hand unsteady despite the smirk. I drifted toward the window, pretending to check my reflection. In the distance, headlights broke through the rain. A black SUV rolled slowly through the gate, its engine low and even. When the car door opened, I felt my heartbeat steady, not quicken. Adam stepped out into the downpour, water cascading off his shoulders as if the storm itself parted for him. His uniform caught the porch light, dark blue, silver insignia gleaming on his shoulders. He moved with the ease of someone who didn't need to announce authority. I turned back toward the room, quietly lowering my glass. Brandon was still talking. Elise was still performing. None of them saw what was coming. Through the earpiece tucked under my hair, Adam's voice came through, faint but clear. Maintain position, don't engage. The truth lands tonight. I glanced toward the old clock again. The second hand ticked with deliberate slowness, each sound slicing the air thinner. For years, this house had been Elise's stage, her perfect illusion of power, wealth, and respectability. Tonight, it was something else entirely, a trap waiting to spring. I took one last look around the room, the portraits, the guests, the fake smiles. Then I exhaled, calm and precise. Let the truth fall where it must. And as the rain thundered against the windows, I felt it. The shift, the stillness before a storm breaks. Adam was here, and the lies that had survived 4 years were about to meet their reckoning. The rain hammered against the windows so hard, it sounded like applause for a play no one believed in. Inside, the air was thick with perfume, money, and deceit. Elise stood at the center of it all, glass of wine raised, recounting her favorite story. How her brilliant husband had built a thriving company. How our father had trusted her above all others. How being the responsible daughter came with such unbearable grace. I stood near the table of white lilies, untouched glass in my hand. Every word she spoke sliding through me like dull blades. Her voice filled the room, dripping false modesty. Guests nodded along, pretending not to see the cracks in her performance. They laughed too easily, eager to stay on the right side of her favor. Then, above the chatter, a low tremor began, a distant, pulsing sound. At first, no one noticed, but as it grew louder, conversation faltered. The chandelier trembled, crystals rattling faintly. The sound rolled over the house, a deep, mechanical thrum that vibrated in the glass. Elise frowned, glancing toward the windows. "What on earth is that?" Brandon chuckled. "Confident as ever. Probably a training flight from the base. Relax, darling. Nobody cares enough about this Texas rain to fly for you." The words had barely left his mouth when the front doors burst open. Wind and rain surged through the entrance, whipping the sheer curtains into the air. The lights flickered, and there he was, Colonel Adam Hale, framed against the storm, rain sliding down the shoulders of his dress uniform. Silver insignia gleamed under the entryway lights, the Pentagon crest pinned neatly against his chest. He stepped inside without hesitation. The air shifted immediately, a ripple of silence spreading through the room. Every conversation died mid-sentence. Elise's smile froze halfway up her face. Adam's eyes swept across the crowd once before landing on me. He inclined his head slightly, voice calm, firm, carrying the weight of command. "Apologies for the delay. Captain Reynolds." He crossed the floor toward me, unbothered by the stares, and pressed a brief kiss against my forehead. His tone lowered, steady enough for only those nearest to hear. "My department just concluded its investigation, and the findings concern a few people in this room." The air fractured. The room seemed to hold its breath. Elise's fingers went slack, her glass slipping from her hand and shattering across the hardwood. Brandon's smile faltered, replaced by a nervous half-laugh. "Hale? You're with the Department of Defense?" Adam met his gaze but didn't answer. He laid a thick folder on the polished table, its seal unmistakable. His words cut through the stunned quiet. "Mitchell Systems is under federal investigation for contract fraud, falsification of medical records, and forgery of documents belonging to the late Colonel Lawrence Reynolds. Would either of you like to explain how that happened?" Brandon blinked rapidly, color draining from his face. Elise tried to speak first, her voice pitching higher, brittle with panic. "He's lying! This is some setup! Tabitha's been feeding him stories! We have proof!" A new voice interrupted her, deep and measured. "Yes, you do." Every head turned toward the doorway. Walter Whitman, my father's longtime attorney, stepped forward, rain still glistening on his coat. In his hands, encased in a clear evidence sleeve, was a single document, the original will of Colonel Reynolds. He announced, eyes fixed on Elise, signed and dated 2 weeks before his passing. It states, and I quote, "Should Elise alter any clause for personal gain, all assets are to be transferred into the Evelyn Reynolds Scholarship Fund, overseen by Tabitha Reynolds." The color drained from Elise's face. She stumbled back a step, clutching the edge of a chair for balance. "That's impossible," she stammered. "You said you destroyed it." Brandon turned toward her, eyes wide. You what?" she screamed, voice cracking. "You promised—" He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his hands trembling as if the air had turned toxic. Adam broke the silence, his voice level, almost clinical. "That will do. For the record, both of you just confirmed destruction of evidence and forgery in front of 2 federal witnesses." Brandon's knees gave out, collapsing into the nearest chair. Elise spun toward me, fury and disbelief twisting her face. "You planned this. You brought him here. You always wanted to destroy me." I stepped closer, my tone calm, almost gentle. "You once told me not to wear my uniform to the funeral because it made people uncomfortable. Look around. Elise. Now you know what fear really looks like." Her lips parted, but no sound came. Behind her, the clock struck 7, outside. The helicopter's blades roared to life again, sending waves of wind through the open doorway. Rain turned white in the wash of its lights, scattering across the marble like shattered glass. The storm outside and the silence inside met in one suspended moment. The lies, the greed, the years of manipulation, all of it teetered on the edge of collapse. Adam turned to me, gave a single nod, the signal that it was over. The evidence had been delivered. The truth had landed. Elise sank to her knees, trembling, mascara bleeding down her face. Brandon just stared at the floor, face ashen, muttering to no one, and through the roar of the rain and the beating blades outside, I could hear the faint echo of my father's voice in memory, steady, calm, proud. "Honor can't be taken from you, Tabitha, only surrendered." I stood still, the uniform heavy on my shoulders, but lighter than it had felt in years. The house around me wasn't my home anymore. It was a courtroom, and justice had finally found its stage. The storm outside was relentless, the kind that felt personal, wind and rain lashing against the windows as if trying to break into the room. Inside, silence was thicker than air. Elise stood frozen in the middle of the living room, her trembling hands hovering near the edge of the table where the sealed document lay. The official copy of my father's will rested beneath the dim chandelier light, its legal stamp gleaming like judgment. Brandon stood a few feet away, trying to steady himself. Sweat darkened the collar of his dress shirt despite the chill seeping in through the open door. His smile flickered on and off like a failing light bulb, his confidence crumbling faster than he could hide it. Adam didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply met my eyes from across the room, steady, certain, and gave a small nod. It was the same look he gave before an operation began. The signal that it was my turn. I stepped forward, unbuttoned my gloves, and placed them neatly on the table beside the will. The paper beneath my palm was cool and rough, but the weight it carried was generations deep. I took a breath that seemed to reach back through all the years of silence, humiliation, and restraint. I spoke slowly, each word deliberate, my voice calm enough to cut through the noise of the storm. "I used to think justice had to shout to be heard," I said. "But tonight, I understand. Real justice doesn't scream. It just stands still until the truth has no choice but to reveal itself." No one moved. The faces around me, relatives who had once whispered behind my back, colleagues of my father who'd pitied me at his funeral, were all lowered now, their confidence slipping away like the rain streaking down the windows. Across the room, Walter Whitman opened the envelope with careful precision. The sound of tearing paper was impossibly loud. His voice, when he began to read, was clear and measured, every word echoing against the walls. "I, Lawrence Reynolds, leave all properties and financial holdings to the Evelyn Reynolds Scholarship Fund, to be managed by my daughter, Tabitha Reynolds. Should any member of my family attempt to alter or forge these documents, their rights to inheritance are permanently revoked." The words hit like thunder. Elise's body sagged, the strength draining from her posture. She sank to her knees, the hem of her black dress soaking up the puddle forming from her spilled wine. Her face went pale, her mascara streaking like ink. "He can't do this to me," she whispered, voice trembling, disbelief splintering every syllable. I looked down at her, my tone quiet, almost kind. "He didn't do this to you. Elise, you did this to yourself." Brandon made a sound halfway between a laugh and a plea. "Look, we can fix this," he said, turning toward Adam, palms raised in surrender. "We can negotiate something. Adam cut him off with a single look. His voice carried the weight of final authority, cold and precise. "There's nothing left to negotiate. The case will be turned over to federal jurisdiction, and as of this moment, this house no longer belongs to either of you." Brandon's mouth opened, but no sound came. He sank back, face slack, eyes flickering with panic. Elise scrambled up, gripping my arm with shaking fingers. "Tabitha, please. You can stop this. We're family. You can't just watch them take everything." I turned to her fully, meeting the eyes that had mirrored mine for most of my life. The same shape, the same color, only colder. There was a time when I might have softened, when some lingering piece of shared childhood might have tethered me to compassion, but that time was gone. "Family doesn't trade on honor," I said softly, "and you sold yours for a compliment and a headline. That's not something anyone can give back to you." The words landed like a verdict, final and irrevocable. She released my arm, her hand falling limply to her side. The only sound left in the room was the rain beating against the glass and the slow tick of my father's old clock, marking the moment the last illusion shattered. For years, Elise had performed. Flawless smile, perfect hair, calculated charm. Now, she stood there stripped of every mask. Nothing left but the hollow shape of her greed. Brandon, ever the opportunist, looked like a man watching the walls of his empire crumble in real time. Adam gathered the files from the table, his movements crisp and methodical. Agents waiting outside would take care of the rest. He paused just long enough to glance at me again, a quiet acknowledgement that the operation, our operation, was complete. As he turned toward the door, lightning flashed, illuminating the framed photographs that still hung on the wall. In one, my father stood between Elise and me, proud and dignified. It struck me how differently I saw that picture now, not as proof of what I'd lost, but as a reminder of what I'd preserved. I looked at the guests who still lingered awkwardly near the walls, unsure whether to leave or pretend they hadn't witnessed a downfall. I wanted to tell them that justice doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives like the storm outside, loud, merciless, cleansing. Elise sobbed once, softly, the sound small enough to disappear beneath the wind. I didn't look at her again. I simply reached for my gloves, slipped them back on, and walked to the door. The air outside hit cold and sharp. The storm was easing, the sky breaking open to faint streaks of silver. Behind me, the echoes of the house, her voice, his silence, the clock's steady ticking, faded with every step. Justice hadn't been about revenge. It had been about balance, about standing still long enough for truth to catch up. And tonight, it finally had. 2 days later, the house no longer looked like a home. It was a case file now, sealed, catalogued, and cordoned off by yellow tape that flapped in the wind. The front gate bore the official seal of the Federal Investigation Unit. Beyond it, rows of black government SUVs lined the street like silent sentinels. The world outside moved on as if nothing had happened. The neighbors kept their distance, blinds drawn halfway, watching through slits while pretending they weren't. The rain had returned, not the furious storm from that night, but a slower, steadier kind. It drummed softly against the hood of the car parked near the driveway. The air smelled of wet earth and old memories. I stood on the front steps, watching as the agents guided Elise and Brandon down the walkway. The two of them no longer looked like the perfect couple who once commanded a room. Elise's hands shook behind her back, where the cuffs caught the light. Brandon's suit hung loose, rain soaking through the fabric, his once gelled hair plastered flat. They didn't speak to each other, didn't look at me. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they'd already run out of excuses to hide behind. There were no shouts, no pleas, no theatrics, only the sound of their footsteps on the stone path, slow and deliberate, like a procession. When the car doors shut, 2 solid, kiddie mechanical thuds, it was the sound of a chapter ending. The kind of ending that doesn't need applause, only silence. I stood there long after the cars had disappeared down the street. My breath came out white in the cold air. I waited for the satisfaction I thought justice would bring, the catharsis, the power, the vindication, but all I felt was the weight of quiet, Not sadness, not triumph, just an emptiness that hummed with its own truth. Justice didn't celebrate. It just settled, calm and unmovable. When I finally stepped back inside, the house greeted me like a hollow shell. The echo of my boots followed me down the hall, bouncing off walls stripped of portraits and laughter. Elise's perfume was gone. The clinking of glasses. Gone. The constant hum of pretense. Gone. Only the low ticking of rain against the window panes remained. In the study, the light was dim. Walter Whitman was there, standing near my father's old desk, his hat in hand. His coat was wet at the shoulders, rainwater dripping quietly onto the carpet. When I entered, he looked up from the papers spread before him. His face was drawn with a kind of gentle gravity, the look of a man who had seen too many endings. On the desk lay a small wooden box. I recognized it instantly. My father's. It had sat on that same desk since I was a child, untouched by anyone else's hands. Walter picked it up carefully and offered it to me. "Your father wanted you to have this," he said softly. I took it, my fingers tracing the grooves along the lid. It was warm, somehow, despite the chill that filled the room. When I lifted it open, the familiar smell of metal and dust rose faintly. Inside lay my father's old pilot's watch, its leather strap worn smooth, its face scratched from years of service. The second hand was frozen, wedged forever between two marks. The sight of it hit me harder than I expected. I remembered the way he used to wind it every morning, the way it ticked faintly through the house like a heartbeat. After his death, I'd found it sitting silent, the gears jammed, as if time itself had stopped the moment he was gone. Walter cleared his throat gently. "He told me once that when you were ready, you'd know what to do with it." I turned the crown between my fingers, just enough to feel the tension in the gears. For a long second, nothing happened. Then, so faint I almost missed it, the second hand trembled. It twitched once, then again, and began to move. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound filled the room like breath returning after a long sleep. It wasn't just a watch anymore. It was something else, an echo of forgiveness, maybe, or the simple truth that some things start moving again only when we finally stop trying to control them. The door creaked behind me. Adam stepped in, the dim light catching on the wet shoulders of his uniform. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched me with that quiet, unwavering calm that had carried me through every storm since I met him. Then, without a word, he shrugged off his coat and draped it over my shoulders. "You did it without me," he said quietly. "I didn't have to intervene. I only opened the door. You walked through it yourself." His voice held no pride, no superiority, just quiet acknowledgement, the kind that doesn't need to be earned, only shared. I looked down at the watch ticking in my hand. "I never wanted revenge," I said. "I just wanted to stand still long enough for the truth to show itself." He nodded once. And it did. We stood there in the stillness, the sound of the ticking watch steady between us. It was the only sound that mattered. Outside, the rain softened, tapering into a drizzle that whispered against the roof. I followed Adam out onto the porch. The street was empty now, washed clean, the air thick with petrichor. Somewhere in the distance, thunder grumbled faintly, like a final exhale. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel haunted, it felt finished. As we walked toward the waiting car, I paused at the gate and turned back one last time. Through the front window, I could see into the living room. The old wall clock, the one my father had wound every morning, was moving again. Its pendulum swayed with perfect rhythm, the ticking faint but certain. I smiled. A small, private smile. "You fixed it," I whispered to the air, though I wasn't sure if I meant him or myself. When I climbed into the passenger seat, the world outside was a blur of silver and gray. Adam started the engine, the tires crunching softly on wet gravel. Neither of us spoke for a while. There was nothing left to say. The rhythmic hum of the engine merged with the ticking from my father's watch resting in my palm. Time, for once, was steady. Not rushing, not stalling, just moving forward, the way it was meant to. As we passed through the familiar streets of my childhood, I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to prove something, to Elise, to my father, To the people who saw me as rigid, cold, unlovable. And how all along, the only thing I'd ever needed to do was hold still long enough for the noise to die down. Justice doesn't roar. It doesn't demand attention. It works in silence, quietly correcting what the world gets wrong. That silence, once my prison, had become my ally. I looked over at Adam, his profile calm against the passing light. He didn't look like the hero in anyone's story, just a man who understood how to let the truth breathe. He reached over, lacing his fingers through mine, and the warmth of that small gesture anchored me more than any victory could. The road opened up ahead of us, winding out of the city into the foothills. The rain had stopped completely now, leaving the air clear, the horizon streaked with faint gold. The first sunlight in days broke through the clouds, painting the edges of everything it touched. I rolled down the window, letting the wind rush in. It carried the scent of cedar and rain, the kind of smell that makes you believe in beginnings again. The ticking of the watch grew louder in my hand, steady, alive. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the rhythm of it sync with my own heartbeat. For years, I'd lived suspended in the second between loss and motion, stuck, like that watch, unable to move forward because I hadn't yet let go. But now, for the first time since my father's death, since Elise's betrayal, since everything fell apart, I felt the weight lift, not gone, but lighter, something I could finally carry. When I opened my eyes again, the sun was breaking fully over the Rockies, its light spilling across the road ahead. The world looked sharper, cleaner, almost merciful. I looked down at the watch again. The second hand kept moving, patient and sure. Time hadn't stopped for me. It had simply been waiting for this moment, for this quiet, for me to start again. And as the car climbed higher into the brightening morning, I realized I was no longer chasing redemption. I was already living it. 1 year later, the world had softened. Mornings in Colorado Springs began in silence, the kind that wasn't empty but earned. The snow outside melted slowly into thin silver streams along the edge of the airfield, catching the pale light of the rising sun. Adam and I had fallen into a rhythm that didn't need words. 2 mugs, black coffee, a quiet window seat overlooking the Rockies. We never rushed the start of the day. After years of storms, peace took a while to believe in, and neither of us wanted to scare it away. From our porch, Pikes Peak looked close enough to touch. The summit caught the first blush of daylight, pink and gold streaks brushing over the ice. The mountain always felt like a reminder. No matter how long the climb, there's always light waiting at the top. I'd been teaching now, leading a leadership program for junior officers at the academy. Young faces, eager and uncertain, the kind that reminded me of who I once was before the world taught me about betrayal and silence. Some of them called me ma'am, with that mix of awe and confusion, the way people do when they realize someone who survived the fire is still standing. I never told them the details. They didn't need them. They only needed to know that strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about learning how to move after you do. Our life had grown quiet but full. Evenings with dinner that Adam somehow always burned. Late-night reports spread across the kitchen table. Laughter in the spaces where once there had been nothing but exhaustion. We'd built something unremarkable, and that was the beauty of it. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. Then one morning, the peace cracked, not in chaos, just a whisper from the past arriving in the mailbox. A letter from Texas. The handwriting was rushed, uneven, the ink smudged from tears or time. My name was written across the front like a plea. I knew who it was before I opened it. Tabitha, I need help. Brandon left. The bank's foreclosing on the house. I'm sorry for everything. Please, just $10,000. Enough to start over. Elise. I read it once. Then again, slower this time. Not because I needed to understand, but because part of me still didn't believe she'd reach out. The woman who had stolen everything, my name, my father's trust, the life she thought I didn't deserve, was now asking for mercy. But there was no anger in me. Not anymore. What I felt instead was a quiet, impossible sadness. She had lived her entire life in a costume, playing a part until the curtain fell, and she was left standing in the dark, not knowing who she was without the applause. I folded the letter neatly, carried it to the fireplace, and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges until her words glowed red, then vanished. The paper folded inward, shrinking to ash. "Fire purifies steel," I whispered. The smoke rose in a pale swirl, catching the sunlight that poured through the tall window. The morning light touched everything it could: my desk, the soft rug, the silver trim on my uniform jacket. I reached up, brushing a finger across the new insignia pinned to my shoulder. Lieutenant Colonel. The promotion had come quietly, handed to me with a handshake and a few words of recognition. No cameras, no speeches, just a file, a salute, and a quiet understanding that I'd earned it the hard way. I didn't need applause. The weight of the silver felt heavier than the stars I'd imagined for myself as a child. Behind me, the steady tick of my father's watch filled the room. The second hand moved perfectly now, smooth and sure. I'd had it cleaned and repaired, but I still kept the scratches, every mark, every dent, the proof of life lived and survived. Sometimes, when the sun hit it just right, it reflected light across the room like a signal. Outside, I heard the crunch of boots on snow. Adam was already in his flight suit, rolling his shoulders beneath the jacket. He was prepping for an early training run at the airfield. I watched him through the window as he adjusted the harness on his helicopter, the same calm focus he always carried, the same quiet assurance that had steadied me through everything. He looked up then, catching my gaze through the glass, and smiled. Just a small one. It was enough. I turned toward the mirror by the door. For a moment, I barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because I'd changed on the outside, but because, for once, I wasn't scanning for flaws or searching for what was missing. The uniform fit differently now. It wasn't armor anymore. It was home. No longer the woman who had stood humiliated at her father's funeral. No longer the outcast forced to defend her own integrity. What I saw now was simple. A woman standing in her own light, shoulders squared, eyes calm. The years had carved deep lines of resilience into me. They didn't show on my skin, but I felt them in the steadiness of my breath. I was once a victim. I whispered to the reflection, then a survivor. Now I'm something else entirely. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering flakes of melting snow across the porch. Adam's helicopter engines roared to life, blades slicing through the cold morning air. The sound filled the sky, powerful yet familiar, like thunder wrapped in rhythm. I stepped onto the porch as the machine lifted into the air. The rising sun struck the metal, painting it in gold. He hovered for a moment, turning the craft toward the mountain ridge, and I raised my hand in salute. He returned the gesture, a brief tilt of his head, before the helicopter banked upward into the open sky. For a long while, I stayed there, the wind tugging at my hair, the smell of jet fuel and morning coffee mixing in the air. The world below shimmered under the newborn light. Snow glistened on rooftops, the mountains stretched endlessly beyond, and the peaks burned in hues of rose and amber. It was the same view my father used to wake me for when I was little, lifting me onto his shoulders and saying, "Remember this. Every dawn means you get another chance to begin right." Back then, I hadn't understood. But now, standing where he once stood, the meaning was clear. Forgiveness wasn't something you gave to others. It was something you gave to time, to let it keep moving. I went back inside, poured the rest of my coffee, and sat by the window as the sunlight crept across the floorboards. The fire had burned down to embers, the last of Elise's letter gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint scent of smoke and paper. The watch on my wrist kept ticking, steady and alive. Each second a reminder that the past no longer owned me. Sometimes, when my students asked about leadership, I told them it wasn't about command or control. It was about endurance, the ability to stay true when the world doubts you, and quiet when your enemies expect you to shout. That morning, as the light spilled fully into the room, I realized how strange peace could feel after so much fight. It wasn't thrilling. It was still, like standing at the top of a mountain and realizing the climb was never about the view. It was about proving you could survive the ascent. Adam's helicopter disappeared beyond the ridge. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything we'd built from nothing. I looked once more toward Pikes Peak. The snow at its crown shimmered under the sun. 1,000 small mirrors, reflecting light back into the world. I placed my hand over the insignia on my chest, the polished silver warm against my skin. Then I said it aloud. not to anyone in particular, but to every version of myself that had once been broken. I was a victim. Then I survived. And now I've won. Not because they fell, but because I'm still standing. The helicopter passed once more across the sky, a streak of light cutting through morning cloud. I smiled, raising my hand again in salute. The golden rays caught on the Air Force emblem pinned over my heart, and for an instant it gleamed so bright it almost hurt to look at, like the truth itself. Justice, I thought, doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be real. And as the first full light of dawn washed over Pikes Peak, I felt it, quiet, certain, and true. The storm was long over. The sky was mine again,